Ladies and gentlemen, let me start with a blunt truth. The West has been living in denial. For decades, Western nations, led by the United States, convinced themselves that they could remain the center of the economic universe forever. They believed that printing money, accumulating debt, and outsourcing real productivity to the rest of the world would never come back to haunt them. But reality doesn't bend to arrogance, and the reality is this: we are now in a multipolar world, and the West has utterly failed to adjust. Denial is not just ignorance, it is a willful refusal to face reality, and reality always has the final say. The West has convinced itself that it can live indefinitely on illusions, that it can print endless amounts of money, pile up limitless debt, and outsource real productivity while still believing it is the center of global power. That is not strength. That is arrogance wrapped in complacency. And arrogance has a price. Every empire in history that refused to acknowledge the warning signs of decline eventually collapsed, not because it lacked the resources to survive, but because it lacked the humility to change. The West is walking the same path, and the first step toward recovery is admitting the truth that denial is destruction. When you deny reality, you don't escape it. You only make the collision more violent when it finally comes. Look at the West's response to inflation. For years, central banks told us it was transitory, a passing cloud in an otherwise sunny sky. They wanted people to believe that printing trillions of dollars, keeping interest rates near zero, and fueling record deficits wouldn't have consequences. But the reality of economics is simple. You cannot create wealth out of thin air. Printing money doesn't create prosperity. It only destroys the purchasing power of the money already in circulation. Yet Western leaders chose denial. They chose easy lies over hard truths. And today, families across America and Europe are paying higher prices, not because of temporary disruptions, but because of decades of reckless policy that they refuse to confront. The danger of denial is that it feels comfortable in the short term. It tells you that you don't have to make sacrifices, that you can keep borrowing, keep spending, keep living beyond your means. But comfort is not security. It is a trap. A nation that lives in denial convinces itself that debts don't matter, that deficits can be sustained forever, and that global dominance is permanent. But history doesn't bend to wishful thinking. Reality eventually forces a reckoning, and when it does, the fall is always harder than the climb. Here's the hook. Denial is not just a mistake. It's a betrayal of future generations. Every dollar printed, every loan taken, every debt piled up today is a burden handed to our children and grandchildren. The West is not just refusing to face its own reality, it is robbing the future of stability and prosperity. Leaders who deny the truth are not protecting their citizens. They are sacrificing them for short-term political survival. That is why denial is more dangerous than ignorance, because it is deliberate. It is a choice to look at reality and turn away knowing that someone else will be forced to pay the price later. And yet there is still time. Denial is a mindset, and mindsets can change. But the clock is ticking. The rest of the world is not waiting for the West to wake up. China is building, India is expanding, and other nations are securing their place in a multipolar order. They are accumulating gold, forging alliances, and preparing for a future where the dollar is no longer the unquestioned reserve currency. They are not in denial. They are in preparation, and preparation is power. The West, by contrast, is stuck in a dream, clinging to an illusion of dominance that is eroding by the day. The lesson is clear: when you deny reality, you hand your destiny to those who don't. The nations that face the truth, that adapt, that plan for change will be the ones who thrive. The nations that cling to denial will be left behind, weakened and dependent. Denial is not safety, it is surrender. And the longer the West refuses to accept that the world has changed, the more painful its awakening will be. Reality does not negotiate, and it does not wait. The West can either embrace it now or be crushed by it later. Debt has been dressed up as prosperity for far too long, and the West has fallen for this dangerous illusion. Leaders parade rising GDP numbers, consumers cheer cheap credit, and politicians boast about progress. But underneath the surface, it is all borrowed time. True prosperity is not measured by how much you can borrow. It is measured by how much you can produce, how much you can save, and how much real wealth you can pass on to the next generation. Debt may create the appearance of growth, but it is nothing more than tomorrow's income spent today. When the bill finally comes due, that illusion of prosperity shatters, leaving behind only weakness, instability, and regret. For decades, the West has lived on this illusion. Families have been told that easy credit cards, zero down mortgages, and endless student loans are paths to opportunity. Governments have promised that deficit spending will drive growth and that central banks can always step in to paper over the costs. Businesses have loaded themselves with cheap debt to buy back stock instead of investing in real productivity. The result is a system built not on strength, but on leverage, a fragile house of cards that looks impressive from the outside, but is hollow inside. The hook here is simple. Debt is not wealth. It is the opposite. It is the mortgage on your future, the chain around your freedom, and the silent thief of your stability. What makes debt so seductive is the short-term comfort it provides. Borrowing allows you to live better than you earn, governments to spend more than they collect, and businesses to expand faster than their profits justify. It feels like growth. It feels like progress. But it is a mirage. Every dollar borrowed today must be repaid tomorrow, often with interest. When an individual lives on credit, eventually the payments catch up and the lifestyle crumbles. When a nation does the same, the consequences are magnified and the collapse is devastating. The West has convinced itself that it can defy this basic law of economics, that it can keep borrowing forever because it is rich enough, powerful enough, or important enough. But reality does not grant exceptions. Every empire that drowned in debt believed the same lie, and every empire that ignored this truth eventually fell. The real tragedy is that debt doesn't just weaken the present, it robs the future. Every borrowed dollar is a promise that tomorrow's citizens will have less freedom, less prosperity, and less opportunity. It is not just bad economics, it is generational theft. The West has chosen immediate gratification over long-term stability, comfort over sacrifice, illusion over truth. And when the reckoning comes, it won't be the politicians who suffer. It will be ordinary families, workers, and savers who see their money devalued, their costs rise, and their opportunities vanish. That is the cruelest betrayal of all. Leaders mortgaging the future for the sake of their own survival today. And yet, there is another hook. Debt addiction always ends in crisis. The West has not just borrowed money, it has borrowed time. Every financial crisis of the past decades has been papered over with more borrowing, more printing, more denial. Each time the bubble grows larger, each time the fall becomes more dangerous. We are approaching the point where the weight of that debt can no longer be hidden, where the interest payments themselves become unsustainable, where lenders lose confidence and the system cracks. That moment is not a possibility. It is an inevitability. The only question is whether the West will wake up, wake up before it is too late. True prosperity is built on discipline, on the courage to live within your means, and on the wisdom to invest in real assets that create lasting value. Debt has been used as a substitute for wealth, but no matter how convincing the illusion, it cannot last. The future belongs to those who produce more than they consume, who save more than they spend, and who understand that borrowing is not a strategy, it is a trap. Debt may buy you time, but it cannot buy you prosperity. The West must relearn this truth because the cost of forgetting it is nothing less than decline itself. Multipolarity is not a theory, not a prediction, but an undeniable reality shaping the world right now. For decades, the West operated under the illusion that it alone dictated the rules, that its dominance in finance, military, and culture would never be challenged. But the world has changed. Nations once seen as peripheral are now engines of growth, centers of innovation, and guardians of resources the West desperately needs. To deny that power is shifting is to deny the rising sun at dawn. Multipolarity is here, and the West's refusal to accept it does not delay its arrival. It only accelerates its own decline. For years, the United States wielded the dollar as a weapon and the global reserve currency as a privilege. This allowed it to borrow endlessly, to consume more than it produced, and to maintain the illusion of unshakable dominance. But while Washington was busy printing, Beijing was busy building. While Europe sank into bureaucracy and stagnation, India expanded its workforce, its industries, and its influence. While the West lectured about globalization, other nations used globalization to accumulate real power. The hook is clear: when you take your position for granted, someone else is already preparing to take your place. The shift toward a multipolar world is not sudden. It has been unfolding in plain sight. China now commands the world's second largest economy, not because it borrowed recklessly, but because it built factories, infrastructure, and industries that produce real goods. India's rise is fueled by demographics, by education, by technology, and by a hunger for growth that the complacent West can no longer muster. Russia, despite sanctions and isolation attempts, still exerts enormous influence through its energy, its resources, and its strategic alliances. Other nations in Asia, Africa, and South America are asserting independence, building trade networks that bypass Western dominance. The balance of power has shifted from one pole to many, and the sooner we accept it, the sooner we can prepare for it. What makes multipolarity so powerful is that it is not a challenge imposed by enemies. It is the natural result of economic evolution. Power gravitates toward production, toward resources, toward discipline. The West once had these advantages, but squandered them in pursuit of comfort, debt-driven consumption, and political expedience. The rest of the world, meanwhile, built steadily, invested wisely, and prepared for a future that was never going to remain Western-centric forever. Multipolarity is not about the fall of the West alone. It is about the rise of everyone else. And that rise is unstoppable. The danger for the West is not multipolarity itself. It is the refusal to adapt to it. Clinging to the belief that the dollar will always reign supreme, that Western militaries will always intimidate, that Western economies will always lead, is a form of self-delusion. Nations are already trading outside of the dollar system, already diversifying their reserves into gold and other currencies, already forming alliances that make Western sanctions less effective. Every year, the West's tools of dominance lose their edge, and every year, the rest of the world becomes less dependent on Western approval. The hook is undeniable. Power is leaving, not because it was stolen, but because it was abandoned. This new reality also carries opportunity. Multipolarity does not mean the West is finished. It means the West must evolve. But evolution requires humility. It requires recognizing that the rules of yesterday no longer apply to the world of today. If the West continues to ignore this shift, it will not just lose influence, it will lose credibility because respect is earned, not demanded. A multipolar world is not about the decline of one, it is about the balance of many. Those who fight this truth will find themselves isolated. Those who embrace it will thrive. The world is no longer a stage where the West alone plays the leading role. It is a crowded theater of nations, each demanding its share of influence, each refusing to bow to old hierarchies. The future belongs to those who recognize this shift, who adapt their policies, their economies, and their expectations to reality. Multipolarity is inevitable, and the only question that remains is whether the West will resist it to its own destruction or accept it as the new foundation for global stability. Sound money has always been the foundation of real power, and history never fails to prove this truth. A society that builds its prosperity on stable, reliable money can grow, invest, and thrive with confidence. But when money is reduced to paper promises backed by nothing but political will and debt, the entire system becomes fragile, unstable, and eventually doomed. The West, led by the United States, has turned its back on sound money in favor of reckless printing and artificial manipulation. And in doing so, it has traded real strength for temporary illusions. The hook here is undeniable. You cannot cheat the laws of economics with ink and paper because in the end, the world always turns back to real value. For centuries, gold and silver were not just commodities. They were the anchors of civilization's trust. They limited governments from spending beyond their means, restrained the greed of politicians, and ensured that when you worked hard and saved, your wealth would hold its value across generations. Sound money was discipline, and discipline built empires. But once that discipline was abandoned, once governments decided they could print wealth instead of earn it, the decay began. Every fiat currency in history has ultimately collapsed, and the dollar is not immune. The difference now is that the West acts as though it is. That denial, that arrogance is what makes the fall even more dangerous. What makes sound money so powerful is not just its physical properties, but the confidence it inspires. People know that an ounce of gold today will hold its value tomorrow, next year, and decades into the future. It is incorruptible, immune to political manipulation, and indifferent to the lies of central bankers. Compare that with the dollar or the euro, where inflation eats away at your savings, where governments dilute your purchasing power every time they print another trillion. That is not money. That is theft disguised as policy. The hook is clear. If your money loses value while you sleep, you are not growing wealth. You are being robbed of it. The West's obsession with fiat money has created a world where illusions dominate. Stock markets inflated by cheap credit are celebrated as growth, even as industries hollow out. Consumers are encouraged to spend more than they earn, while savings are punished through negative real interest rates. Politicians promise the impossible, knowing the printing press can always be used to cover the gap. But every illusion comes to an end, and when the trust in paper collapses, the return to sound money is not voluntary. It is inevitable. Look around the world and see the shift already happening. Nations are quietly increasing their gold reserves, diversifying away from the dollar, and preparing for the day when paper promises no longer carry weight. This is not speculation, it is preparation. Those who understand the value of sound money are building a fortress against the storm that fiat systems have created. The West, meanwhile, continues to deny the storm exists, convinced that its money will hold power simply because it always has. But history teaches the opposite lesson. When trust in money is lost, so is power, and nations that refuse to respect this truth collapse from within. The power of sound money is that it restores honesty to the economy. You cannot print gold. You cannot manipulate it with the stroke of a pen or the push of a button. It forces responsibility. It rewards productivity. It punishes recklessness. A world anchored to sound money is a world where wealth is real, where savings matter, where nations rise because they produce, not because they borrow. The West once understood this. Its rise was built on discipline and respect for value. But today, it gambles on a fantasy that it can break the rules of economics without consequence. The reality is simple. Power lies not in the ability to print money, but in the credibility of money itself. That credibility is crumbling, and with it, the illusion of Western dominance. Those who return to sound money will inherit the future because real value always outlasts fake promises. The hook is sharp and clear. Fiat is failure. Discipline is strength. And only sound money holds the key to lasting power. Adaptation has never been optional in history. It has always been the deciding factor between survival and collapse. Civilizations that adjusted to changing realities thrived, while those that clung stubbornly to old models were swept aside. The West today is dangerously close to becoming another cautionary tale, not because it lacks resources, innovation, or potential, but because it refuses to adapt to a world that no longer revolves solely around it. The hook here is simple. When you stop evolving, you start decaying, and decay never ends in stability. It ends in decline. The signs are everywhere. The global economy is no longer controlled from one capital, no longer dictated by one currency, no longer led by one worldview. Multipolarity is the new reality, and nations that embrace it are building resilience, partnerships, and influence. Yet the West continues to behave as if it still holds unquestioned dominance, issuing sanctions as if its word alone is law, printing money as if the dollar's supremacy is eternal, and consuming as if it can forever outsource production. This is not strength, it is delusion. And delusion is the enemy of adaptation. Adaptation requires humility, the recognition that what worked yesterday may not work tomorrow. The West, however, has grown complacent from decades of privilege. It has mistaken temporary advantages for permanent entitlement. Instead of adjusting to new competitors, it dismisses them. Instead of reforming broken systems, it patches them with more debt and denial. Instead of preparing for new challenges, it clings to outdated structures, hoping the world will remain frozen in the past. But history punishes arrogance, and punishment is merciless. Those who fail to adapt are not given second chances. They are left behind. The hook is this: refusing to adapt does not stop change. It only ensures you are crushed by it. Look at technology, where disruptive forces reshape industries overnight. Companies that once dominated, Kodak, Nokia, Blockbuster, vanished because they assumed their dominance was untouchable. The same law applies to nations. America and Europe once drove global industry, yet much of that industry has migrated elsewhere, and instead of adapting by revitalizing production and discipline, the West has drowned itself in easy credit and hollow promises. That is not adaptation, it is avoidance. And avoidance always ends in collapse. Adaptation is not weakness, it is strength. It demands courage, foresight, and the willingness to accept uncomfortable truths. It means acknowledging that debt cannot sustain prosperity forever, that money printing cannot mask real economic decay, that other nations will not simply remain subordinate. The West must learn this lesson quickly because every year of denial makes the cost of change greater, just as individuals who refuse to change bad habits eventually face consequences. Nations that cling to failed systems eventually face collapse. Adaptation is the only alternative, yet there is still opportunity. The West still has the ability to reform, to shift from consumption back to production, from illusion back to reality, from arrogance back to humility. But this requires decisive action, not complacency. It requires leaders who are willing to tell the truth about debt, about money, about global competition. It requires citizens who demand responsibility instead of empty promises. Adaptation means facing the storm head on, not pretending it doesn't exist. The storm will not wait for you to prepare. It is already here. Adapt or be left behind. The nations embracing multipolarity, investing in sound money, and building real industries are securing their future. The West can either learn from them or watch them lead. Adaptation is not just an option, it is survival. The hook is undeniable. History will not remember those who resisted change. It will remember those who embraced it and thrived. The West still has a choice, but time is not on its side. Change is often feared, resisted, and treated as a threat, but in truth, change has always been the birthplace of opportunity. Every major transformation in history, whether economic, political, or technological, created winners and losers. The losers were those who clung to the past, who denied the new reality, who believed yesterday's advantages would last forever. The winners were those who embraced the shift, who saw beyond fear to possibility, who had the courage to prepare and the discipline to act. Today, as the world transitions into a multipolar order, the West views this change as a loss, as if the rise of other nations is automatically the fall of its own. But the hook is this: change does not have to destroy you. It can remake you if you are bold enough to embrace it. The West has been conditioned to see its dominance as permanent, to believe that leadership is a birthright rather than something earned through production, innovation, and discipline. But permanence is an illusion. Dominance in any era belongs to those who adapt, and the multipolar world is handing the West an opportunity to reinvent itself. Instead of fearing competition from nations like China, India, or Russia, it could use this shift as a wake-up call to return to fundamentals, real industries, sound money, fiscal discipline, and innovation that creates value rather than speculation. Competition is not the end of strength. It is the sharpening stone of progress. Yet the West has chosen to fear what could make it stronger. What makes this moment unique is that change is happening on a global scale. Supply chains are diversifying, currencies are being rethought, alliances are forming outside the West's orbit. These shifts may feel like threats, but in reality, they are signals, opportunities to adjust, to find new markets, to build resilience. Instead of clinging to the outdated idea that the dollar must forever remain the world's only reserve currency, the West could use this moment to restore integrity to its financial system, to back its money with real value, and to rebuild trust that has been eroded by decades of reckless policy. The hook is clear: when the old rules stop working, it is not the end of the game. It is the beginning of a new one, and those who write the new rules will lead. Change always exposes weaknesses, but it also reveals strengths you never knew you had. The West's addiction to debt, consumption, and easy money is a weakness, but its history of innovation, its capacity for reinvention, and its cultural dynamism are strengths. The problem is not that the West lacks the tools to succeed in a multipolar world. It is that it lacks the will to use them. Every period of disruption is also a period of possibility. When the old system breaks, it clears the ground for something stronger, more sustainable, and more honest to emerge, but only if you are willing to let go of illusions. The hook here is powerful. Opportunity hides in plain sight, disguised as change, and only those with vision recognize it. While politicians frame multipolarity as a threat, individuals and nations that see beyond the fear will seize it as a chance to rise. Investors who understand the shift will position themselves in real assets, in gold, in industries that produce tangible value. Nations that embrace multipolarity will strengthen their economies by diversifying and collaborating. The West could be part of that future if it abandons denial, but if it refuses, it will only watch others take the opportunities it wasted. This is the choice before us: fear change and be crushed by it, or embrace change and thrive because of it. The multipolar world is not a verdict of decline. It is an invitation to evolution. Those who resist will fade into history, remembered only for what they once were. Those who accept and act will be remembered for what they became. Change is here. Opportunity is here. And the only question left is who will have the courage to seize it.